Good day. I'm going to talk about diseases of infancy and childhood. Each stage of development of the infant and the child is prey to somewhat different group of disorders. The developmental stages is divided into four as stated in your textbook. The first is the neonatal period, which covers the first 4 weeks of life. It is followed by infancy, which is the first year of life, then age 1 to 4 years, and then age 5 to 14 years of age. Congenital anomalies, disorders relating to short gestation and low birth weight, and sudden infant death syndrome represent the leading causes of death in the first 12 months of life. Once the infant survives the first year of life, the outlook brightens measurably. In the next two age group, the 1 to 4 and the 5 to 9, unintentional injuries resulting from accidents have become the leading cause of death. Among the natural diseases, in order of importance, congenital anomalies and malignant neoplasm assume a major significance. The outline of the topic will be as follows. We are going to talk about congenital anomalies, prematurity and fetal growth restriction, perinatal infection, fetal hydrops, inborn errors of metabolism and other genetic disorders, sudden infant death syndrome, tumor and tumor-like conditions. The first on the list will be congenital anomalies. Congenital anomalies are anatomic defects that are present at birth, but some, such as cardiac defects and renal anomalies, may not become clinically apparent until years later. The term congenital means you are born with it, but it does not imply or exclude a genetic basis for the birth defect. It is estimated that about 120,000 babies are born with a birth defect each year in the United States. They are the most common cause of mortality in the first year and contribute significantly to morbidity and mortality throughout the early years of life. In a sense, anomalies found in live-born infants represent the less serious developmental failures with embryogenesis that are compatible with live birth. The terms are introduced as you go through the congenital anomalies. The two terms that we are to tackle first are malformation and disruption. The table will show you the difference between malformation and disruption. As you can see, malformation represents primary error of morphogenesis. Simply stated, it implies abnormality at the time of organ development. On the other hand, disruption results from secondary destruction of an organ or body region that was previously normal in development. However, there are extrinsic disturbances that led to the abnormality that is seen in the baby. Going back to malformation, malformation can be the result of a single gene or a chromosomal defect, but are more commonly multifactorial in origin. Malformation may present in several patterns: congenital heart defects, anencephaly, which is absence of the brain, involve single body system, whereas in other cases, multiple malformations involving many organs may coexist. So, at this point, it should be clear to you that malformation is something that occurs at the time the organs are still developing. As to disruption, the development of the organs are normal. However, the extrinsic disturbance, like for example, the presence of amniotic bands, would then cause the abnormality in the baby. What are amniotic bands? Amniotic bands denotes rupture of amnion with resultant formation of bands that encircle the fetus. This encircling of a fetal part will cause then the abnormality in the development of the fetus. A variety of environmental agents may also cause disruption, but in our book, basically what was discussed is the presence of amniotic bands. These are examples of images which will show you malformation. One example of malformation is polydactyly, in which you have an increased number of digits, cleft lip, and cleft palate. The amniotic bands will cause disruption of morphogenesis. As you can see from the image, you have there the arrow of the amniotic band. The placenta is at the right side of the diagram, and the band of amnion extends from the top portion of the amniotic sac, encircling the leg of the fetus. So this is an example of disruption. The fetus is already formed, and then you have the amniotic band, which led to the eventual deformity. Now, deformations and sequence are the next term that we have to tackle. When you say deformation, they are like disruption. They represent an extrinsic disturbance of development rather than an intrinsic error of morphogenesis. Deformations are common problems affecting approximately 2% of newborn infants. Fundamental to the pathogenesis of deformation is a localized or generalized compression of the growing fetus. With that being said, the most common underlying factor would be uterine constraint. Between the 35th to the 38th weeks of gestation, we're expecting that there is a rapid rise in the size of the fetus, which outpaces the growth of the uterus, and the relative amount of amniotic fluid, which normally acts as the cushion, also decreases. So this decrease in amniotic fluid is what we termed as oligohydramnios. So anything that can hamper the development of the fetus, for example, you have maternal causes like first pregnancy, a small uterus, a malformed uterus, the presence of a mass, like for example, leiomyoma, may lead to deformation. This is an example of a bicornuate uterus. Again, this leads to deformation because it offers uterine constraint to the growth of the baby. Now, a sequence, on the other hand, is a cascade of anomalies triggered by one initiating aberration. Again, it is triggered by one initiating aberration. Congenital anomalies occur singly. In the remaining cases, multiple congenital anomalies can also be recognized. The constellation of anomalies may be explained by a single localized aberration in organogenesis, which sets into motion secondary effects in other organs. The example given is that of oligohydramnios, otherwise known as Butter sequence. This is an example of an intrauterine fetal death resulting from oligohydramnios. Oligohydramnios is defined as a decreased amount of amniotic fluid. It may be caused by a variety of unrelated maternal, placental, or fetal abnormalities. There are many causes of oligohydramnios. It includes leakage of amniotic fluid because of rupture of the amnion, uteroplacental insufficiency resulting from maternal hypertension or severe toxemia, and renal agenesis in the fetus. This is because the fetal urine is a major constituent of amniotic fluid. Oligohydramnios then leads to fetal compression. The fetal compression associated with significant oligohydramnios in turn results in classic phenotype in the newborn infant, which includes flattened fascie, positional abnormalities of the hands and the feet. The hips may also be dislocated. The growth of the chest wall and lungs are also compromised, that frequently the lungs are hypoplastic. Occasionally, again, this may lead to fetal demise, just like the previous image that I have shown you. The nodules in the amnion are expected to be present. This is what you call as amnion nodosum. So, oligohydramnios then serves as the trigger, and because of this, it may eventually lead to fetal compression, giving you the characteristic phenotype. That's why these are referred often to as the Potter sequence. So, these are again other images. The classic phenotype in the newborn infant would include a flattened fascie, as it is evident here. I have shown you a while ago images as well, wherein you are also expecting that there may be abnormalities in the hands and the feet of the patient. The hips may also be dislocated. Moving on, let us talk about malformation syndrome. When you say malformation syndrome, it is a constellation of congenital anomalies which are believed to be pathologically related. That in contrast to sequence, it cannot be explained by a single localized initiating defect. Syndromes are often caused by a single etiologic agent, such as viral infection or a specific chromosomal abnormality, which simultaneously affect several tissues. Some of the terms that are also introduced in the book are as follows. You have agenesis, aplasia, hypoplasia or hyperplasia, hypotrophy or hypertrophy, atresia, and dysplasia. What then causes congenital anomalies? It is divided into three major categories. One would be genetic, second would be environmental, third will be multifactorial. Genetic causes of malformation includes all the previously discussed mechanism in the chapter of genetic diseases. Virtually, all chromosomal syndromes are associated with congenital malformation, examples of which includes your Down syndrome and other trisomies like Turner and Klinefelter as well. Most chromosomal disorders arise during gametogenesis and hence are not familial. Single gene mutations characterized by Mendelian inheritance may underlie major malformation. A typical example of this is holoprosencephaly, which is the most common developmental defect of the forebrain and midface. A Category number 2 would be environmental influences. Under environmental influences, you have viral infection, drugs, and irradiation to which the mother was exposed during pregnancy, which led to the fetal anomalies. Among the viral infection, rubella was a major cause. Fortunately, maternal rubella and the resultant rubella embryopathy have been virtually eliminated as a result of maternal rubella vaccination. Drugs and chemicals are also suspected to be teratogenic. Some of the known agents would be thalidomide, alcohol, anticonvulsants, warfarin, and retinoic acid. Thalidomide is used as a tranquilizer. It causes an extremely high incidence of limb malformation. Alcohol, when consumed in modest amount during pregnancy, would lead to prenatal and postnatal growth retardation, facial anomalies like, for example, microcephaly, short palpebral fissure, and maxillary hypoplasia, including psychomotor disturbances. This is actually what is labeled as the fetal alcohol syndrome. Cigarette smoking derived nicotine has not been convincingly demonstrated to be a teratogen. However, there is increased incidence of abortion, spontaneous abortion, premature labor, and placental abnormalities in pregnant smokers. Babies born to mother who smoke often usually have low birth weight and may be prone to sudden infant death syndrome. So it is best to avoid nicotine exposure during pregnancy. Diabetes mellitus is one common entity, and that is the reason why when you are pregnant, it is important to monitor the glucose level. There is such a thing called um, diabetic-induced pregnancy-induced diabetes. The problem is if your glucose level goes up, maternal hyperglycemia, it will induce fetal hyperinsulinemia, which may result in fetal macrosomia. By fetal macrosomia, it means you will have organomegaly and increased body fat and muscle mass. Cardiac anomalies, neural tube defects, and other central nervous system malformation are some of the major anomalies that are also seen in diabetic embryopathy. Last would be multifactorial inheritance. It implies an interaction of environmental influences with two or more genes of small effect. Is the most common genetic cause of congenital malformation. In this category, you have cleft lip, cleft palate, and neural tube defects. This shows you that in the pathogenesis of congenital anomalies, the timing is very important. The timing of the prenatal teratogenic insult has an important impact on the occurrence and the type of anomaly that will be produced. The intrauterine development is divided into two phases. One is the embryonic period, and the second is the fetal period terminating at birth. In the early embryonic period, which is the first 3 weeks after fertilization, an injurious agent damages either enough cells to cause death and abortion or only a few cells, allowing the embryo to recover without developing defects. Between the 3rd to the 9th week, the embryo is extremely susceptible to teratogenesis, and the peak sensitivity during this period occurs between the 4th and the 5th week. During this period, organs are being crafted out of the germ layers. The fetal period that follows organogenesis is marked chiefly by the further growth and maturation of the organs, with greatly reduced susceptibility to teratogenic agents. At this point, the fetus is then susceptible to growth retardation or injury to already formed organs. So, this illustration somewhat depicts what I'm trying to say. So, the timing of the exposure of the fetus to the teratogen is very important. Is it at the time of organ development, or is it at the time that the fetus is already formed? If it is at the time of the organ development, then you are expecting developmental defects. If it is at the fetal period wherein organogenesis is done, then you might expect growth retardation or injury to already formed organs. There is some compounds that are known to cause problems, like for example, valproic acid. Valproic acid is considered as an anti-epileptic medication. It is recognized as a teratogen during pregnancy. It disrupts the expression of transcription factors known as the homeobox protein. These HOX or homeobox proteins have been implicated in the patterning of limbs, vertebrae, and craniofacial structures. In addition, you also have retinol or vitamin A derivative. The problem here is sometimes it is used as a treatment for acne. However, excessive exposure to retinoic acid is considered teratogenic. Infants born to mothers treated with retinoic acid have a predictable phenotype. Retinoic acid embryopathy is the term, which includes CNS, cardiac, and craniofacial defects such as cleft lip and cleft palate. This is an example of cyclopia. The example here, if you will read your book, is linked to a plant teratogen, which we call as cyclopamine. Cyclopamine is a plant teratogen, and pregnant sheep who feed on this plant give birth to lambs that have severe craniofacial abnormalities, including holoprosencephaly and cyclopia, a single fused eye. The compound is an inhibitor of hedgehog signaling in the embryo. Mutations of hedgehog can present with holoprosencephaly and the single eye, as illustrated in this baby. So let us go now to the second part of the topic, which would be prematurity and fetal growth restriction. When you say prematurity, it is defined as gestational age less than 37 weeks. It is regarded as the second most common cause of neonatal mortality. The hazards of prematurity may give rise to any of the following: respiratory distress syndrome, necrotizing enterocolitis, sepsis, intraventricular and germinal matrix hemorrhage. There are major factors affecting. The first on the list would be uterine, cervical, and placental structural abnormalities. For example, if you have a mass like leiomyoma, if you have abnormal implantation of the placenta, for example, it is implanted in the cervix instead of the fundus. If you have premature separation of the placenta, that is what is known as abruptio placenta, then it may lead to delivery, and eventually the baby is delivered as premature. Multiple gestation or twin pregnancy may also lead to premature delivery. Preterm premature rupture of membranes is one complication seen in approximately 3% of all pregnancy, which may lead to preterm deliveries. Rupture of membranes before the onset of labor can be spontaneous or induced. Preterm premature rupture of membrane refers to spontaneous rupture of membrane occurring before 37 weeks. So as the bag of water is leaking out, eventually delivery may be inevitable so that you end up with preterm labor. Premature rupture of membrane, as I have mentioned, refers to spontaneous rupture of membrane occurring after 37 weeks of gestation. This distinction is important because after 37 weeks, the associated risk to the fetus is considerably decreased. The fetal and maternal outcome after preterm premature rupture of membrane will depend on the gestation of the fetus. Second trimester has a dismal prognosis. So often this will lead to the death or demise of the baby. Second on the list, as you can see, would be intrauterine infection. This is a major cause of preterm labor with or without intact membrane. Intrauterine infection is present in approximately 25% of all preterm birth. Histologically, how do we diagnose this? After the baby is born, the placenta is submitted to the pathologist. And this is how it looks like. So we are to look for the presence of inflammation on the placental membranes. These are sections of the chorioamniotic membrane, in the villi, or basically in the umbilical cord. As you can see in all of the images, you have a lot of inflammatory cells, predominantly neutrophils. So you'll see chorioamnionitis, villitis, and phenicitis. So once you see that, then that concludes that more likely the cause of prematurity or preterm delivery would be your intrauterine infection. There are many organisms implicated, as it is listed here. In developing countries, malaria and HIV are significant contributors. The toll-like receptors, which binds bacterial components as natural ligands, have emerged as key players in this process. It is postulated that signals produced by toll-like receptors deregulate prostaglandin expression, which in turn causes smooth muscle contraction, thereby leading to premature birth. So fetal growth restriction then is defined as SGA of less than 2,500 grams. The baby is expected to be term, undergrown rather than immature. This may be due to a number of fetal, maternal, or placental abnormalities. This is an image which shows you the normal baby, adequate for gestational age, right at the middle, comparing it with an SGA or small for gestational age. And on the right-hand side is an large for gestational age, typical of infants of diabetic mothers. Again, the term for that is fetal macrosomia. So for fetal growth restrictions, we are to consider a number of factors. The first on the group would be your fetal factors. Fetal factors or fetal influences are those that intrinsically reduce growth potential of the fetus despite an adequate supply of nutrients from the mother. Usually, this is caused by chromosomal disorders, congenital anomalies, and congenital infection. Chromosomal abnormalities may be detected in up to 17% of fetus and in up to 66% of fetus with documented ultrasonographic malformation. For chromosomes, it may include triploidy, trisomy 18, trisomy 21, trisomy 13, and a variety of deletions and translocation. Those most responsible for fetal growth restriction are the TORCH group of infection. TORCH means Toxoplasma, Rubella, cytomegalovirus, and herpes virus. Infants who are SGA because of fetal factors usually have a symmetric growth restriction. This is otherwise known as proportionate, meaning all organ systems are similarly affected. It may also be placental abnormalities. During the third trimester of pregnancy, vigorous fetal growth places particularly heavy demands on the uteroplacental blood supply. Therefore, the adequacy of placental growth in the preceding mid-trimester is extremely important, and uteroplacental insufficiency is an important cause of growth restriction. It is said to be that placental factors would lead to asymmetric or disproportionate growth retardation with relative sparing of the brain. There are multiple causes. The insufficiency may result from umbilical placental vascular anomalies such as single umbilical artery, abnormal cord insertion, placental hemangioma, premature separation of the placenta, abnormal implantation of the placenta, placental thrombosis and infarction, placental infection, TORCH being most notable, as I have mentioned, and twin pregnancies, referring to the last bullet, which is multiple gestation. For the maternal abnormalities, the most common factor associated with SGA infants are maternal conditions that result in decreased placental blood flow, vascular diseases such as preeclampsia, and chronic hypertension are often the underlying causes. Another class of maternal disease increasingly being recognized are thrombophilias, such as the acquired antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Inherited diseases of hypercoagulability are also associated with recurrent early pregnancy losses. The list of other maternal conditions associated with SGA are as follows. You have narcotic abuse, alcohol intake, which I have already explained a while ago, cigarette smoking as well. Drugs causing fetal growth restriction can include both classic teratogens, such as chemotherapeutic agents, and some commonly administered therapeutic agents like phenytoin. Maternal malnutrition, in particular prolonged hypoglycemia, may also affect fetal growth, but the association between SGA infants and because of the association of nutritional status of the mother to the baby leading to SGA. So the SGA infant faces a difficult course. It depends on the underlying cause of the fetal growth restriction and to a lesser extent the degree of prematurity. There is significant risk of morbidity in the form of a major handicap, cerebral dysfunction, learning disability, and hearing or visual impairment. Let us go now to another disease entity, which is called neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, or RDS. Neonatal respiratory distress do have a lot of causes, but among the causes enumerated, the most common cause is respiratory distress syndrome, also known as hyaline membrane disease. This is called hyaline membrane disease because characteristically, there is a deposition of a layer of hyaline of proteinaceous material in the peripheral air spaces of the infants. The other causes, as enumerated, would be excessive sedation of the mother, fetal head injury during delivery, aspiration of blood or amniotic fluid, and intrauterine hypoxia, which can be secondary to coiled cord. So what happens in RDS, or hyaline membrane disease? The problem here is lung immaturity. In untreated infants not receiving surfactant, the RDS generally present as an infant who is almost always preterm, has a weight appropriate for gestational age, but is usually associated with the male gender, maternal diabetes, and delivery by cesarean section. Resuscitation may be necessary at birth, but usually within a few minutes, rhythmic breathing and normal color can be reestablished. Soon afterwards, often within 30 minutes, breathing becomes more difficult, and within a few hours, the cyanosis will then be evident. Fine rales can be seen over both lung fields. If a chest X-ray is done, usually it will reveal minute reticuloglandular densities, producing the so-called ground glass appearance. In the full-blown condition, the patient is expected to have persistence of respiratory distress. Cyanosis increases, and even the administration of 80% oxygen or ventilatory method will sometimes fail to improve the situation. Eventually, the infant may succumb to death after 3 to 4 days. If the infant survives beyond 4 days, the chance of recovery is there. So how will you assess it? If an autopsy is done, the problem in respiratory distress syndrome is that the lack of surfactant will then lead to collapse of the lungs. The prematurity is causing reduced surfactant synthesis, storage, and release. And the decreased alveolar surfactant will then increase the alveolar surface tension, leading to atelectasis, or this is what we call as an airless collapsed lung. So that an autopsy, when you actually put this in a basin, it will sink because there is no air. That tells you that this part particularly is atelectatic. Atelectasis will bring about an even perfusion and hypoventilation so that your patient is expected to have hypoxemia and carbon dioxide retention. The sequence of events that leads to the formation of hyaline membrane, which is shown here, is due to the remarkable paucity of neutrophilic inflammatory reaction associated with this membrane. When the alveoli are basically poorly developed, so as I have said, they are expected to be collapsed. When the infant dies early in the course of the disease, necrotic cellular debris can be seen in the terminal bronchioles and alveolar ducts. The necrotic material becomes incorporated with eosinophilic hyaline membrane that lines the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. The membranes are largely made up of fibrin and mixed with cell debris derived chiefly from necrotic type 2 pneumocytes. So as I was saying, you will expect hypoxemia and carbon dioxide retention. The immaturity of the lungs is the most important substrate on which RDS or HMD develops. It may be encountered in full-term infants, but it is more frequent in those born before there is around 28 weeks. It occurs in about 60% of infants born at less than 28 weeks of gestation, 30% for those born between 28 to 34 weeks, and less than 5% for those after 34 weeks of gestation. So as I have mentioned, the fundamental defect in your RDS is the deficiency of the pulmonary surfactant. If you will recall, surfactant is predominantly composed of lecithin, phosphatidylglycerol, surfactant-associated proteins. The importance of surfactant is it keeps or it allows your alveoli to be expanded with air inside. So if you have decreased alveolar surfactant, you are expecting increased alveolar surface tension, thereby leading to atelectasis. Surfactant production is by type 2 alveolar cells. It is accelerated after the 35th week of gestation. It is modulated by a variety of hormones and growth factors, including cortisol, insulin, prolactin, thyroxine, and transforming growth factor beta. The role of glucocorticoids is particularly important. So, the hypoxemia and the carbon dioxide retention is expected to have as an effect acidosis, eventually pulmonary vasoconstriction, pulmonary hypoperfusion, which leads to endothelial and epithelial damage, leading to the formation of your hyaline membrane characteristic of this disease. So how do you go about treating the patient? So you can give exogenous surfactant as it is written in the first bullet. However, the major thrust in the control of RDS focuses on prevention. So how do you prevent it? You have to delay the labor, ideally beyond 35 weeks. If you cannot, then you can have prophylactic administration of exogenous surfactant at birth to extremely premature infants, particularly if the gestational age is less than 28 weeks. Recovery begins to occur usually within 3 to 4 days. Since the problem is the lung, it is expected that oxygen is required. However, high concentration of ventilator-administered oxygen for a prolonged period may give rise to complications. One is what you call as retrolental fibroplasia, otherwise known as retinopathy of prematurity. Retinopathy of prematurity has two-phase pathogenesis. The first one is the hyperoxic phase, wherein expression of the pro-angiogenic vascular endothelial growth factor is markedly decreased, which causes endothelial cell apoptosis. The VEGF levels rebound after return to relatively hypoxic room air ventilation, that's phase 2, which induces renal vessel proliferation, otherwise known as neovascularization, which is characteristic of the lesions seen in the retina. Secondly, the major abnormality in bronchopulmonary dysplasia is a striking decrease in alveolar septation. This is manifested as large alveolar structures and dysmorphic capillary configuration. Bronchopulmonary dysplasia is caused by a potentially reversible impairment in the development of alveolar septation, the so-called saccular stage. There are multiple factors: hypoxemia, hyperventilation, prematurity, inflammatory cytokines, and vascular maldevelopment. The release of pro-inflammatory cytokines are increased in the alveoli of infants with bronchopulmonary dysplasia, suggesting the role of these cytokines in arresting the pulmonary development. So, if the other problems that the patient with RDS may face would be PDA or patent ductus arteriosus, intraventricular hemorrhage, and necrotizing enterocolitis. Let us have a short break before we proceed with necrotizing enterocolitis.